So I'm gonna tell you a bit about my grandmother. My family come from Uganda in East Africa, and my grandma is a formidable woman, which is where I get it. And she is amazing. She's a dressmaker. She owns her own compound with chickens and fruit trees. She is well into her 80s and still runs around and keeps all her own affairs and keeps the garden in order. And she raised my mother and her siblings effectively on her own. And she is one of the biggest inspirations that I have. But here's the kicker. She doesn't speak a word of English. And I've never been able to speak the language of my family, which is Luganda. And this connection I have with her, this really strong connection, has always been one that we couldn't bridge with words or with language, which for someone like me, who has often used words to navigate most things in my life, it's been something that I've never been able to get over, really. It's something I perpetually mourn. So I wrote a poem for my grandma, and it's called Jaja, which means grandma in Luganda. And it's about loss, for sure. It's about the things you lose when you come from more than one place, when you're a hybrid child of globalization or immigration. But then I'm going to talk a bit more about how actually I have a lot to be grateful for, both from my grandmother and my mother. But this is a poem for her. I do not know you. I've made you of dress cotton, banana leaves, patchwork quilts of quiet smiles and stories I could not understand. And as I hold your hands, I know they've known more work in this past hour than mine will in their entire lifespan. And I see the hardship of 1,000 winds that have blown across your face. So I trace a map of apologies across your fingers and hope some shapeless ghost of my meaning lingers. And you are a goddess. I see your shoulders pressed together where your wings once met, and yet we can only exchange small nods of acknowledgement because my world doesn't slot into yours, though I crawl on all fours for meager scraps of my identity, endlessly grieving each mistranslation, misunderstanding, misinterpretation, each shift in time. I've always been inventing you through a generation gone by. And as we sit in silence, seedlings of the same tree, I can imagine. Well, I'd tell you of the short skirts that girls in England wear, and how snow falls like balls of bliss on nights cold as an Eskimo's kiss. And I'd ask of the past, the laughter shared and the songs once sung, what mum was like when she was young if I weren't trapped with the handicap of this British tongue. And I imagine all the talks we'd have, tucked in a candlelit cave, cradled in a culture clash, hoping that the Tower of Babel might bleed into oblivion and somehow this miracle might unfurl. And we'd have been the best of friends in a different world. But I do not know you. I've made you of dress cotton, banana leaves, patchwork quilts of quiet smiles, and stories I will never understand. And in this land of lost language, I am neither stranger nor native. And the weight of these wasted words cannot be translated. Thank you. Thank you very much. So as I said, when I first wrote that piece almost 6 years ago now, it was a poem about loss and about mourning, for pieces of myself that I felt I could never get back or never even owned in the first place. But thinking about this summit and what it means to be a child of immigration myself, I began to think about my grandma, this woman who worked really hard so that her children could go to the best schools in Uganda, my mother being one of them. And then my mother, through that education, thinking, you know what, my child is going to have the best. She is going to have the next level of opportunity. And, that's how often these things work in families, isn't it? There's always this urge, this pull to make sure that the next generation has that little bit more. And so my mother came here to the UK in her 20s and had me. And I'm a British citizen. And I've had so many opportunities because of the sacrifices my mother made. She moved us to suburban areas where the schools were good and the families were white and middle class and suburban. And, there were difficulties with that. I was invariably the only child of colour in an entire school. There were difficulties with that, but the opportunities that I got, I can't begin to quantify that. And the strength of that migrant struggle, the resilience, the propensity to hard work. And this is why the narrative of laziness, of entitlement, of people stealing benefits and wanting an easy way, it just doesn't speak true to my family's experience, certainly, and to anyone else I know of immigrant origins. It speaks of a hard work and of a quiet strength that you can't put into words. And the women that I come from a lineage of very strong, willful women who worked really hard so that I can be stood here. I can't quite believe it. So thank you for taking the picture. It will show my mother that the hard work paid off, I hope. So thank you.